The Hittite Warrior by Joanne Williamson, Chapter 7, The Sacrilege. The season of the winter rain drew toward its close, and the time of death and resurrection of the god Adonai was upon us, the festival of the first fruits. The city was crowded, for many farmers and other people from out of town made it their business to come into Tyre at this time of year to take part in the religious rites. We ourselves had gone to the temple, put ashes on our foreheads, bowed our heads to the dust in the courtyard, and bewailed the death of the god. The beautifully carved and columned door of the house of Etubal had been dutifully smeared with the blood of a lamb, one of the firstborn of his own flocks in the country. It was on the holiest night of all that the great sacrilege was committed. It was a strange night. There was something in the air that I did not understand. I had been busy in the warehouse for the past weeks and had paid little attention to anything outside. True, I had heard rumors and whispers here and there. 3 temple ships mysteriously lost with all their cargo. Great fleets of warships massed on the shores of Crete and Achaia. A terrible insult from the Philistine ambassador to the chief of Sidon. It was, as I have said, a strange night. Outside, from time to time, we heard clashing of cymbals and the shrieking of pipes and voices bewailing the death god. And inside, the house of Etubal sat about their evening meal and did not even taste it. I could not understand this, for I was surely hungry. I looked at them, wondering at their silence. Jotham was not there, but no one remarked upon his absence, and there was something in their faces that made me afraid. Achil the Philistine grows insolent, Hannibal said that night to his father. Etubal did not reply to Hannibal, and suddenly the young man sprang to his feet. "Why should we listen to his insolence?" he cried. "He is our servant. If it were my place, I would have him beaten and forbid him ever to set foot on our ships again." "Patience, my son," said Etubal. "The priests are right. A time of trouble is at hand for the land of Canaan. But we have weathered such times before with our wits and our obedience to the gods. Above all, with our obedience to the gods." Suddenly, Metubal rose from her rug. Her face was a greenish white. Etubal looked after her nervously, and I thought he half raised his hand, as if he would make the sign against evil. "What is wrong with her?" I asked. "You must ask her," said Etubal, and he added strangely, "Remember that this is a holy night, and he who blasphemes in any way brings down the wrath of heaven upon his head and breaks the law of the land." He sat still on the rug, looking old and sick and sad. I still remember him like that, for though I did not know it then, that was the last time I ever saw him. I could not understand why he should have given me such a warning. I did not understand what it was that was hanging over the house. There was something in Hannibal's face that made me shy of asking him, and Jotham was not there. Later that evening, I passed the fine hangings of the grandmother's apartments, heard voices within, and asked if I may enter. Metubal was seated by her grandmother, the little dog in her arms. It was trembling, having been made uneasy by all the noise outside. Metubal's eyes were red and swollen. The little servant girl was playing melodies on her flute in the corner, but no one listened to her. "Something strange is happening in this house," I said to them. "Achil the Philistine has spoken as if he were the master instead of the servant, and Hannibal looks sick, and you turned pale at the mention of gods, and now I see that you have been crying. What is wrong?" It was the grandmother who replied. Her face was hard as stone. "She weeps for her cousin Jabin." Jabin, I thought, of the spoiled, sickly-looking little boy, and frowned. "Well, what is the matter with him?" "He is to die tomorrow when the sun is high in the fire of Moloch, and we, like the rest of the city, must see it done." I felt as if someone had struck me a blow in the chest. Then slowly things became clear to me. The whispers and rumors about the insolence of the Philistines in Sidon, and 3 ships lost at sea, the boldness of Achil and the light in his eyes. All the activity that day near the temple of Moloch. I understood. The shadow of the sea people had gathered over Tyre and all the coast of Canaan, and they were going to try to ward it off in the ancient manner, with the torture and death of a child. "The priests have said that Moloch is angry," whispered Metubal. "They say he must have a gift to show our love and our fear of him." The black image of Moloch rose before my eyes in all its ugliness, and I could no longer shut it out. Clumsily, I tried to comfort Metubal. "It may be that something will happen before tomorrow," I said. "It may be that they will relent and save him." Metubal looked at me with frightened eyes. "Save him? And bring down the wrath of Moloch upon the city?" I thought of the ox carts and the chariots and the burnings and killings of the sea people at home, and I said, "No more." "I will see it done," said Metubal. "All of us will see it. That is why we are favored in Canaan. That is why we have survived every trouble. Because we withhold nothing from the gods, and we give our gifts gladly." Suddenly she broke into sobs and hid her face in her arms. "He's so little, he must be frightened." The grandmother took her in her arms, but her bitter eyes were upon the little image of the beautiful lady, and I remembered that the only bread and wine were offered as sacrifice to the one god of Akhenaten. I could think of nothing to say. I wished that Jotham would come. Perhaps he could comfort her. I went through the house and into the courtyard, calling his name. But Jotham was nowhere to be found. All night in the streets were noisy with passing bands of musicians, processions of priests, temple dancing girls, and celebrating people. Sometimes frenzied groups would go by the house, shrieking and slashing themselves with knives in their fervor. Toward morning, however, much of the city became silent and deserted, for all the town had flocked toward the high place where stood the holy grove of Adonai the Lord, where they would celebrate the rising of the sun and the resurrection of the God. Feeling the quiet outside on this holiday morn, I rose from my bed and I went out into the streets to walk. But I found no peace. There were still the stones beneath my feet, and the high walls of brick and stone hemming me in, and the smells of the city were still there. And there was still the thought of what would happen tomorrow in the temple of Moloch, when the sun was high. Then suddenly it was no longer quiet. A group of armed guards from the temple garrison had come into the waterfront. They asked me roughly what I was doing there. What's wrong? I asked them. There has been a theft, said the captain shortly. The warehouse of Etebal is to be searched. You had better come with us. The warehouse of Etebal? Searched? I stared at them as if they had gone mad. Search the property of Etebal? As if it were a hut of a slave? Etebal is an elder, I reminded them. You need leave to enter his warehouse. A great thing has been stolen, said the captain grimly, and we have leave to enter anywhere, even into the house of a high priest, until this is found. Come with us. The door of the warehouse yawned like the entrance to a dark cave, and the temple guards were not anxious to enter, even with their swords and torches, so they commanded me to go before them. It was dark at first, and I stumbled about among the bales, wondering if there were anything in here, and what it was we were looking for. A strange feeling had come over me that something terrible and fearful was taking place, and not knowing what it was only made it worse. After a while, the warehouse became a little brighter from the torches, but the corners were still dark. From the first, I had a feeling that something was there that should not have been. Perhaps the guards felt the same thing and were uneasy, for they began to make an unnatural lot of noise to reassure each other. They moved about aimlessly, thrusting swords into bales and barrels, and shouting out threats to the unknown thief who might be hiding there. They seemed to have forgotten me. Something caught my eye. It was a movement behind one of the bales in the darkest corner of all, and my skin began to crawl. There was too much activity among the soldiers for them to notice it, and drawn by curiosity, in spite of fear, I moved towards what I had seen. A dark figure stood behind the bale. A flare of light crossed the corner, and I saw who it was. It was Jotham, and there was something with him, something small that was clinging to him and trying to hide. Then I knew what it was that had been stolen, and the hair rose on the back of my neck at the enormity of the sacrilege. I moved back, and then I stopped, for I saw that Jotham was holding a knife. One of the guards was coming to the corner. I turned toward him, my body shielding Jotham and the child from his sight. I felt the point of the knife at the back of my neck. There is nothing here, I said. The guard was a nervous young man who wanted to believe me. He hesitated for a moment, and I felt my hands grow cold. One of the others called to him, "Have you found anything?" And the young guard swallowed. "Nothing," he said at last, and moved away. I started to follow, but I felt an arm go tight around my neck, and again the point of a knife. "Don't move," Jotham whispered. "Let them go. You stay here." And after stumbling about for a while, the guard gave up. Talking among themselves in troubled voices, they left the warehouse, and I was left alone with Jotham and the child. Chapter 8. The Boat. Jotham took his arm from around my neck, but kept a tight hold of his knife. He was trembling from fear. His eyes were bright and fierce. "Do as I tell you," he said to me, "and you too." He pushed his foot on the frightened child, and to him he added, "Take off that robe." "But it's cold still," whimpered the little boy, his voice shaking. Jotham cuffed him, and the child began to cry. "Do as I say, or I will let them have you back." "You," he said to me, "bring me some of the dark stuff over there. Don't try to run, or I will throw this knife, and then, though you have been my friend." I saw that it was wiser not to argue with him. Not wanting a knife in my throat, I obeyed, stumbling about in the dark, for the sun had not yet begun to rise. I brought a bolt of woolen stuff to Jotham, who with his knife slashed off enough to wrap the child and cover his purple-bordered tunic. "Now go ahead of me," he said, "and if you cry, Jabin, I will throw you into the water and drown you." "Where will you go?" I asked him. "To the mainland by boat," said Jotham. "You too." With a sinking heart, for I was afraid of boats, I moved ahead of him to the door of the warehouse. There was no one about on the quay, so we went outside. "Don't try to run," said Jotham again, flashing his knife in my eyes. We made our way in silence down to Etabal's wharf. Jotham dragged Jabin roughly along behind him. There was a small boat there with an oar, and at Jotham's command, and the little Canaanite boy jumped in like a cat. "Now you," Jotham said to me. I felt sick, looking at the frail thing swaying from side to side beneath me. But I closed my eyes, prayed softly to Shub of the double axe, and I jumped. My feet hit the shallow bottom of the boat, and the world seemed to rock crazily about me. I almost went into the water, which would surely have been the end of me. But instead, I fell to my knees and crouched in the bow, clinging to the sides and shaking with terror, while Jotham jumped in and the rocking began again. "Take an oar," he said, and my knees still trembling, I started to obey him. Then something happened. Another group of soldiers, Egyptians this time, had come onto the waterfront. Jotham was turned away from them and did not see them. They were coming toward Etabal's wharf, and in another moment, if we stayed as we were, they would be able to see us, for the sun was beginning to rise. This was my chance. I did not even have to cry out and risk Jotham's knife. I had only to stay silent, and I would be safe, and the wrath of Moloch would be averted from the city. I will never know why, but I heard myself saying softly, "Jotham, get down, there are soldiers on the quay." Jotham fell flat on the bottom of the boat and pulled Jabin down with him, his hand over his mouth. I crouched too, as low as I could, and we lay still, the boat moving quietly with the water. We listened to the sound of the men's feet as they came closer, and soon heard their voices above us. Jabin did not even whimper, and I tried not to breathe. Jotham's chest did not move, so I suppose he too was holding his breath. Finally they passed on. We lay silent there, till there was no sound but the lapping of the sea against the wharf. Then Jotham raised his head and let out a breath and a long sigh. "It's all right," he said. "No one is here." In silence we took our places on the boat. I had never held an oar before, but I found that it fitted easily enough in my hand. Before I realized what was happening, we were clear of the wharf. Our progress was uneven at first, but I did as well as I could. Jotham was looking at me curiously, and I knew he was wondering why I had warned him. I was wondering myself. To steal the sacrifice of a god was an offense. I had never even dreamed of committing or helping to commit, and I was sure that disaster would now follow me for the rest of my life. As for Jotham, "Well, where will you go now?" I asked him. "You can never go back to Tyre." "I know that," said Jotham. "When we are far enough south from the city, I will leave the boat and sink it. Then I will go inland, into the hills, where we will be safe as anyone can be in this country." "What's in the hills?" I asked him. "Sheep and wolves," said Jotham. "Some towns and vineyards, rough land, some things that are dangerous, like slave raiders and Canaanite troops. But you can dodge them if you try. Now what are you crying about?" For the tears were running down Jabin's face, and he was sniffing and coughing. "I don't want to go to those hills," he sobbed. "I want my own house, and I want my mother." Jotham stared at him in disgust. "Look at him," he said. "Why is he worth it?" He stopped, looking pale and grim. I knew that he was realizing, perhaps for the first time, just what he had done for the sake of this frightened, fretful little boy. For he was outside the law now, an outcast among the Canaanites as well as his own people. There would be no more books to read or peaceful rest in his great bed in the house of Etabal. No more hours of happiness in the quiet apartment of the Lady Maris, and he would never see Metabal again. It occurred to me, too, that I might find myself under a cloud when I got back, and I looked at Jabin as grimly as Jotham did. But the child seemed to be tired from crying, and sat pale and silent in the bottom of the boat. I took off my outer garment and wadded it into something like a pillow. "Here," I said grudgingly, and shoved it in the back of him. He lay his head on it, and after a while slept. "How did you do it?" I asked Jotham at last. "And how did you dare?" "It was strange," said Jotham. "I never meant to do it. It just happened. I went out to walk in the streets, and I saw the procession with this one," gesturing towards Jabin, "in the middle of it. The eunuch priests of Astarte were taking him to the temple to be prepared. But they were so taken up with wailing and beating their breasts for the death of Adonai that they were not even watching. And he was so frightened he could hardly walk. And when he saw me, he called my name. I didn't even think. I just beckoned to him, and he slipped away from them as easily as that. I had him down in the warehouses before they even knew he was gone." The sun was high when Jotham finally pulled ashore. The heights of Tyre could still be seen, but we could surely not be seen from them. Jotham drew the boat up onto a stony beach and then shook Jabin by the shoulder. "Wake up," he said, more kindly than he had spoken to him before. "We're here." Jabin sat up blinking fearfully, and Jotham pulled him out of the boat. Then he looked at me. "You will have to come with me," he said. "I must be sure of getting far away from Tyre before they know that I have left the city." I shrugged. I did not blame him for not trusting me. It was always better, I suppose, not to take chances. I looked around me. The sun was shining and the air was fresh and clean. All was quiet and peaceful. I thought of the narrow alleys and the high wall of Tyre and the smell of the dye house. I did not mind being Jotham's prisoner for a little while, but I was to be a prisoner for longer than I thought, and Jotham was not to be my captor.